crows had always been a nuisance in our small town, so when the population seemed to expand in June of 2017, nobody thought it was strange. To them, it just meant more troublesome birds to deal with. To me, it meant something else entirely. My grandmother, who had passed away that February, had been terrified of the crows. Why? Because a flock of crows is called a murder. She was convinced that those creepy blackbirds represented death, and that if you saw a flock, it meant that you or someone you knew would soon meet a tragic end. For most of my life, I didn't share her paranoia. How could I, when there was no proof to back it up? But everything changed the day my parents were killed in a car accident. I was the only survivor, sitting in the back seat, and minutes before we were hit by that truck, I spotted a group of about 7 crows perched on a telephone wire. And on the morning Nana drew her last breath, a dozen of those terrible creatures appeared in the front yard. So, when the crow population mysteriously grew, I sensed tragedy and horror for the townspeople. But I couldn't speak up about it. Everyone already thought I was insane, and I didn't want to fuel that fire. Everyone I knew had, at some point or another, told me I was depressed and should seek professional help. I didn't want to speak to someone who was paid to listen, but I couldn't deny the facts either. At the age of 19, I was alone. My parents had been dead for 12 years, Nana, who took me in, had been gone for only 4 months. I had thrown myself into school and work, but it wasn't enough to get me through those sad, lonely hours at home, with nothing but crows for company. One morning, I woke up to their squawking, a terrible cacophony that made my ears ring. It was a Saturday, and I didn't have work. I would have gone back to bed, but with all the noise, that was out of the question. I went downstairs, put on water for tea, and stood at the kitchen window, watching the crows mill about. Beneath the sea of black, I could see that the grass had gone yellow and dry. We hadn't had much rain this summer. Maybe the heat was getting to the birds. It would certainly explain all their bitching. The phone rang. I picked it up and smiled at the voice of my best friend. I had known Maya since we were little, and she had helped me through the loss of my parents, and later, the loss of Nana. But Maya had her own share of trauma. Just a month earlier, she had been raped while walking home from work one night. The man grabbed her from behind and dragged her into a darkened alley. After he had violated her, he disappeared into the night, leaving Maya crumpled up on the concrete like a discarded paper bag. He hadn't been caught. "Hi, Larissa." Maya's tone was cheerful, but I could hear the faint tremor in her voice. It killed me inside to know how much pain she was trying to suppress. "Hey, girl. How are you feeling?" "I'm not sick, Larissa. You know what I mean." She sighed. "I'm fine. I'm more worried about you." "Maya, I appreciate your concern, but just this once, you need to put your needs first. After what you've been through. You're my best friend, Larissa. I care about you, and that sadistic asshole can change that." I lowered my voice. "Speaking of which, have you heard anything new from the police?" "No. I swear, if they don't find him soon, I'll hunt him down myself. And deliver his head to the police in a silver platter." Maya snorted, and I heard the smile in her voice. "That sounds like the Larissa I know. Hey, what's that in the background?" "Fucking crows," I grumbled. Behind me, the kettle began to whistle. "They've taken up residence on my front lawn. How many are there?" "It looks like 100. Shit. That's insane, even for this town." "I know. I have to run. I'll swing by this afternoon, okay?" "Sure." "And Larissa?" "Yeah? Maybe you need a scarecrow." I laughed, shaking my head. "Maybe. Bye, Maya." I made myself a cup of tea, then sat at the kitchen table and tried to ignore the incessant caw-caw-cawing outside. If this doesn't let up, I thought, I'm getting out Grandpa's old hunting rifle. One of the birds took flight, and I watched its inky black shape soar up, and up into the brilliant blue sky above. Tap 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 tap. I jerked awake from a semi-doze on the couch and ran a hand through my hair. Thinking the tapping sound was someone at the door, I stood up, only to hear it again. Tap 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 tap. It wasn't the door. I turned around and was met with the beady black-eyed gaze of a crow. This was a big sucker, with a sharp beak. And he was pecking at the window. "Hey!" I clapped my hands together. "Hard. Shoo. Go away. Get." It didn't move. "Go. Get away." The stupid bird just pecked at the glass again, tap 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 tap, and I wondered just what the fuck it was up to. It had gotten my attention, yes, but was that all? Was it trying to tell me something? Shit, I thought, shaking my head. I'm going insane. My stare down with the crow was interrupted by the doorbell ringing. Thankful for even a minute away from that damned bird, I went to open the door. Maya stood there, her long dark hair hanging over her shoulder in a thick braid, and she looked as if she was trying really hard not to laugh. "Well, you sure weren't lying about the crow problem." "It's not a problem, it's a full-on crisis." I ushered her inside, slamming the door shut behind her. "It wasn't even half this bad yesterday. I just woke up this morning, ambushed by crows. It's freaking me out." "Why? Remember what my grandma used to say? About a group of crows?" "Oh, Larissa." Maya put her arm around me. "That's just a superstition. Nothing's going to happen. The crows were there when my parents died. And when Nana died. How can I be sure?" Maya frowned. "I know you'll hate me for saying it, but you really need to see a therapist." "Screw that. I'm serious, Larissa. And I don't want to talk about it." She sighed. "Got any booze?" "It's only 2 o'clock." "Exactly." I smirked and fetched 2 beers from the fridge. Sitting on the porch wasn't an option, so we settled in the living room. I closed the blinds, but I could still hear those fucking crows. Maybe I should call an exterminator. They're crows, not cockroaches. Well, what can I do? Give it some time. They'll go away eventually. They always do. I studied my best friend, taking in the violet half-moons beneath her eyes and the pallor of her skin. "You haven't been sleeping well, have you?" She sighed, turning the beer bottle over in her hand. "Honestly? No." "Nightmares?" Even over a decade later, I still had the occasional nightly flashback to the car accident. "No. I just can't sleep, knowing he's out there, doing God knows what." "Oh, Maya. What if he rapes another girl?" She shook her head in agitation. "I wish I could have given the police a better description. Maybe he would have been caught by now." "Don't say things like that, Maya. None of this is your fault, and anyone who tries to tell you otherwise deserves a cactus shoved up their asshole." Maya smirked and wiped her eyes, before edging closer. We sat with our arms wrapped around each other, both a little woozy from the beer. "We're both pretty screwed up, aren't we, girl?" "Yep. Maybe that's why we're friends. Birds of a feather flock together, right?" I groaned. "Do not talk to me about birds right now." "Sorry." Maya ended up staying until the evening. We ordered a pizza, binge-watched Netflix, and talked about whatever pointless shit came to mind. Maya had stopped drinking after that first beer, so she was okay to drive, but I insisted on walking her to her car. She didn't protest much. I think she was more afraid than she would admit. Back inside my house, I gathered our glasses and plates and carried them to the kitchen. The crows hadn't left. In fact, there were even more of them now than in the morning. My chest felt tight, and Nana's words echoed in my ears. "A flock of crows is a murder, a flock of crows is a murder." This wasn't normal. I couldn't just laugh it off, ignore it, or simply wait for the problem to go away. The crows represented something. Death. Tragedy. And I sensed that whatever it was would befall me. Was I even safe in my own house? I went upstairs and fell asleep wearing earbuds. But it wasn't enough to muffle the squawking of what sounded like the world's largest flock. No, murder of crows. I spent Sunday indoors, reading and messing around on Facebook, doing my best to ignore the birds. On Monday, I had to go to work. I was a waitress, and it paid shit, but at least it got me out of the house. "You look tired, Larissa," my boss remarked when I walked in. "Blame the birds." "What do you mean?" "Crows. My front yard is full of them." "Strange." "Yep. I can barely see the grass anymore." I spent the following 5 hours taking orders and serving people their meals. By the time my shift ended, I smelled of coffee and grease, and wanted nothing more than to get home and shower. There was a crow perched on the hood of my car. "Oh, you have got to be shitting me." I practically shrieked. The volume of my voice should have scared the bird off, but it just stared at me. It wasn't until I got into my car and started to drive that it flew away. On my way home, I drove past a local park. I was shocked to find a police car, along with strips of yellow tape and a gawking crowd. I should have just kept driving. But after the insanity of the past few days, I wasn't thinking straight. So I parked and went to see what was happening. The crowd was thick, and I couldn't see much of the scene, but I did spot a blue tarp, draped over something shaped like a body. Blue uniformed policemen were surveying the scene. "What happened?" I asked. "They found a body," said a random woman. A girl. She was raped and beaten, and left there. Speechless, I simply turned and went back to my car, pretending not to notice the crows perched in a nearby tree. A flock of crows is a murder. I was shaking so hard it's a miracle I made it home without crashing. 2 more weeks passed. 2 more bodies were found. Both attractive young women, sexually assaulted before being killed. The police believed it was the same man who had assaulted Maya, and that she was lucky to have survived. But they couldn't find him. Meanwhile, my front yard was still filled with crows. The flock didn't grow, thank God. But it didn't shrink either. I sensed that I would be the monster's next victim, and that the crows symbolized my impending death. So I took precautions to keep myself safe. I kept my doors and windows locked at all times, and began keeping my grandfather's hunting rifle under my bed. I made sure never to stay out past sunset, because the killer always struck at night. One thing I didn't get was why the crows had come to me, and me alone. None of my neighbors, it seemed, had the same problem. Sure, crows were abundant in this town. But so many gathered in one place was just weird. Maybe I really was crazy. Maybe all that cawing had gotten to my head. Or maybe the crows were tormenting me because I believed what they represented. It almost seemed like they were taunting me, feeding off my fear. So I waited. I waited. I went to work and came straight home after. I talked to Maya, and my other friends. I lay awake at night, listening to the crows. And I prayed that somehow, I could fight fate. Late July. 3 more girls had turned up dead, bringing the death toll up to 6. The police were no closer to finding the culprit, which made no sense. This was a small town, an outsider couldn't hide forever. Sooner or later, someone would notice. Oh, and the crows were still hanging about. One day, I had to cover for a sick coworker, and didn't come home until evening, just as the sun was setting. I stomped up the front walk, flanked on either side by crows. There were so many of them, packed together so tightly that not even an inch of grass beneath was visible. But for once, they weren't squawking. They stood there, staring at me with beady black eyes, still and silent as the Queen's Guard. "Can't you leave me the fuck alone?" I barked. As I shoved my key into the lock, I decided enough was enough. I was going to get the hunting rifle and pump these horrid creatures full of hot lead. I wouldn't stop until each one was dead. I didn't care about possible consequences. I just wanted them gone. I opened the door, my fingers already twitching with anticipation, and put one foot inside only to stop, suddenly, as I felt the unmistakable bite of cold steel between my shoulder blades. "Scream and I'll shoot," the voice hissed in my ear. It sounded like death, a blackened, leafless tree in the middle of winter. A silent graveyard, blanketed with autumn leaves. I froze. My heart ceased to beat, then started up again, slamming painfully against my ribs. My pulse quickened, and all I could hear was the blood pumping in my ears. He wrapped one arm around my chest and moved the gun to my temple. I still had one hand on the doorknob, the other was pinned to my side. I could feel the crows, watching the scene. They would be the only witnesses to my death. And the killer would escape into the night once again. "Unless you want to die," the monster hissed, "you will do exactly as I say. You will let me fuck you. And you won't scream. You won't fight back. Do you understand?" "Yes," I whimpered. "Good." His hand slid down, and he fumbled with my skirt, unzipping it and letting it fall around my feet. I could feel his erection through his jeans, pressing against my thigh. The sound of my lace panties ripping kicked my fight-or-flight response into overdrive. And with the strength born out of sheer panic, I wrenched my hand free and punched him. Hard. He let out a startled grunt and stumbled back, falling down the porch steps, blood streaming from his nose. "You fucking whore!" he bellowed, and lunged at me, but I had already slipped inside the house. He began throwing his bulk against the door as I stumbled into the kitchen and retrieved a knife. "Get back here, you little bitch. I'll slit your fucking throat." I had to act fast. The door was old, and soon, he would break it down. Then he would get inside and it would be curtains for me. The knife was clutched tight in my hand, my knuckles white, my fingers cramped. I was shaking violently, my knees buckling. Only the adrenaline in my system kept me standing, but I couldn't move. With the terrible screech of ripping wood, the door caved in. He lunged at me, fists swinging, and in a final desperate act to save my life, I plunged the knife into his chest. He gasped in shock, and his arms dropped limply at his sides. I stepped back, and he collapsed, the knife still sticking out of his chest. Blood pooled around him, a sticky crimson puddle smelling of copper. My ears were ringing. My chest felt tighter than a straitjacket. I stepped over his body and knelt in the doorway, staring aimlessly out into the night. The crows stared back. I had killed a man. Not just any man. I had killed a monster, an evil son of a bitch who had raped my best friend and stolen the lives of 6 other girls. A man who would have killed me if not for the knife and the remaining wits I'd kept about me. And the crows had seen it all. I looked down at my hands, still stained with the monster's blood. And then it hit me. The crows didn't symbolize my impending death, or that of anyone I loved. They symbolized the deaths of those poor girls. The death of the monster who took their lives. And the remaining lives that would have been stolen if not for me. I had killed a man. I was a murderer. But maybe a hero as well. As I knelt there, mulling all this over, the birds began to flap their wings. Their movements seemed perfectly synchronized, almost rehearsed. The collective flapping of so many wings produced a wind. It blew my hair back and ruffled my clothes. The birds rose upward, all at once, like a black velvet curtain being drawn back from a window. Up and up they went, into the night sky. So many of them that they blocked out the moon and stars, casting me in shadows. I watched as they flew away, leaving my lawn bare for the first time in weeks. The yellow grass looked so dull and lifeless, compared to the sea of black. I watched them fly away, further and further, until they vanished over the horizon, leaving behind an indigo sky speckled with silver stars, lit by a crescent of silver moon. And I stayed there, kneeling on my front porch, until I got too cold and the tears in my eyes blurred my vision.